Before the world erupted into total war, the Pacific was a place of uneasy peace. Across the blue waters of the Pacific Ocean, trade ships moved steadily between nations, carrying oil, steel, and the ambitions of empires. But beneath that calm surface, tensions brewed, deep, complex, and unstoppable. The year was 1939. Europe had once again fallen into conflict as Germany invaded Poland. Great Britain and France declared war, igniting a second global struggle in less than a generation. But across the Pacific, another storm was gathering, one that would soon pull the United States into the deadliest war in human history. The rise of Imperial Japan. Japan's path to Pearl Harbor began long before the first bomb fell. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan had transformed itself from an isolated island nation into a rising industrial power. It defeated China in 1895. It stunned the world by defeating Russia in 1905, the first Asian power to triumph over a major European empire. With victory came confidence, and with confidence came ambition. By the 1930s, Japan's leaders envisioned their nation as the dominant force in Asia, the heart of what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To achieve that, Japan needed resources: oil, iron, and rubber, the lifeblood of modern warfare and industry. But Japan lacked these essential materials. Its islands were rich in spirit, but poor in natural resources. So, to sustain its growing empire, Japan looked south, toward the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia. And that path would inevitably bring it into conflict with one of the world's great industrial giants, the United States of America. In the 1930s, relations between the U.S. and Japan were complex. America had long seen itself as a Pacific power, holding territories like the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii. Meanwhile, Japan viewed itself as Asia's rightful leader, a nation destined to free the continent from Western colonialism. At first, both nations kept their distance. But as Japan expanded its empire into China, the balance began to crumble. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, establishing a puppet state. The world condemned it, but no one intervened. Then, in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Cities like Shanghai and Nanking fell under brutal assault. The images shocked the world. Civilians slaughtered, entire neighborhoods burned to ash. For the United States, which had long supported China economically, this aggression could not be ignored. Tension slowly replaced diplomacy. By 1940, Japan's aggression pushed America to act. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, aware of growing instability, began placing economic restrictions on Japan. Washington imposed trade embargoes, first on aviation fuel and steel, then on oil, the single most critical resource Japan needed. The embargo hit Japan like a hammer. 80% of its oil came from the United States. Without it, the nation's factories, ships, and aircraft would soon grind to a halt. Tokyo was faced with an impossible choice: yield to American pressure and withdraw from China, or seize the resources it needed by force. And deep within the imperial palace, Japan's leaders debated their course. Some favored diplomacy, hoping to negotiate with Washington. Others, led by military hardliners, believed time was running out. They argued that Japan's survival depended on securing new oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. But to do that, Japan would have to strike south and neutralize the one force capable of stopping them: the United States Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In 1940, President Roosevelt made a strategic decision. He ordered the U.S. Pacific Fleet to move from California to Pearl Harbor. It was meant as a deterrent, a message to Japan that America was watching. The harbor, surrounded by volcanic mountains and turquoise water, became home to hundreds of warships, submarines, and aircraft. The pride of the fleet, battleships like the Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia, stood as monuments of American might. But not everyone agreed with the move. Many officers believed keeping the fleet at Pearl Harbor made it vulnerable, a tempting target in the middle of the ocean. Still, the decision stood. The Pacific Fleet remained in Hawaii, the symbol of America's presence in the Pacific. By the summer of 1941, Japan's patience had run out. The oil embargo was suffocating its military machine. Diplomatic talks with the United States stalled, and behind closed doors, the Imperial Japanese Navy began planning what many considered unthinkable: a surprise strike on Pearl Harbor. The plan was bold, even audacious: destroy America's Pacific Fleet before it could interfere, cripple its naval power long enough for Japan to seize control of Southeast Asia. And by the time the United States recovered, Japan's empire would be untouchable. The operation's architect was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a seasoned naval strategist and former attaché to the U.S. Navy. Yamamoto understood America's power. He had studied at Harvard, traveled the country, and admired its industrial might, but he also believed that Japan had no other choice. If war was inevitable, Japan must strike first, and strike hard. As autumn arrived in 1941, the pieces began to move. In Tokyo, Japanese diplomats continued negotiations with the United States, buying time while their military prepared for war. In secret, 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, gathered in the remote Kuril Islands, far north of Japan. Their mission was known only to a handful of men. They would sail under strict radio silence across the northern Pacific, a route so isolated that no one would expect it. Their destination, Hawaii. Meanwhile, in Washington, American intelligence picked up fragments of Japanese communications, but no one could piece together the full picture. The warnings were there, hidden among thousands of intercepted messages, but the idea of a direct attack on Pearl Harbor seemed impossible. After all, Japan was still negotiating for peace. In early December 1941, the world stood at a fragile balance. Europe was engulfed in war. Nazi Germany dominated the continent. Britain fought desperately to survive. The Soviet Union bled on the Eastern Front, and across the Pacific, Japan prepared to make its move. On the morning of November 26, 1941, Japan's carrier strike force, the Kito Butai, slipped out of Hitokapu Bay under cover of darkness. The sailors on board didn't know their exact target. They only knew their orders: sail east, maintain radio silence, and await further instruction. As the ships cut through the cold Pacific waters, the fate of nations followed them. Back in Washington, negotiations continued. Japan's diplomats, unaware of the fleet already at sea, met with American officials, still discussing possible settlements. They asked for the embargo to be lifted, for trade to resume, for recognition of their conquests in China. But the United States stood firm. There would be no compromise unless Japan withdrew its forces. For Tokyo's military leaders, that answer was clear enough. There would be no peace. War had already been chosen. It was only a matter of when. As December began, Pearl Harbor was peaceful. American sailors spent their weekends in Honolulu, enjoying the island sun. On the ships anchored in the harbor, routine continued: drills, maintenance, and mail from home. No one suspected that within a week, those same waters would burn. The calm Pacific breeze carried no warning, no sign of the storm moving silently across the ocean. For the men of the Pacific Fleet, it was just another day in paradise. For Japan, it was the final countdown. The stage was set, the fleets were in motion, and the world was just days away from one of the most shocking moments in history. As the last days of November 1941 slipped away, the Pacific Ocean carried more than waves. It carried destiny. While diplomats in Washington exchanged polite words, a fleet of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers cut silently through the northern seas, hidden by cold winds and darkness. Their mission was secret, their path uncharted. Ahead lay Pearl Harbor, and the beginning of a new world war. The plan to strike Pearl Harbor was codenamed Operation Z. It was the most daring naval operation Japan had ever attempted. a bold assault conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto knew the risks. Japan's entire naval strategy depended on speed and surprise. If the attack failed, the carriers would be stranded far from home, hunted across the Pacific by American forces. But Yamamoto also understood something deeper. Japan's war could not last long. To survive, it needed a quick, decisive blow that would cripple America's ability to fight back. The target was clear: Pearl Harbor, the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. To execute Operation Zed, Yamamoto turned to one of Japan's most skilled tacticians, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier strike force. Known as the Kido Butai, Nagumo's fleet was a floating city of steel and aircraft: 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and a string of support vessels. A total of 353 aircraft were prepared for the mission: torpedo bombers, dive bombers, high-level bombers, and Zero fighters. In secret bases across Japan, pilots trained relentlessly. They practiced torpedo runs in shallow water, learning to adjust for Pearl Harbor's depth, only 40 feet. Engineers modified torpedoes with wooden fins so they wouldn't dive too deep. Every detail was studied, rehearsed, perfected. They even built replicas of the harbor to simulate their attack routes. Each pilot memorized his target, a specific ship, hangar, or airfield. To protect the mission's secrecy, the fleet maintained complete radio silence. No signals, no transmissions. Not a single word would escape across the airwaves. Even among Japan's high command, few knew where the carriers had gone. The fleet disappeared into the vast Pacific, a ghost armada hidden by nature itself. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, diplomats continued to meet with American officials, unaware that the carriers they represented were already sailing toward war. Messages were exchanged, memos drafted, promises made, all while the countdown to Pearl Harbor ticked quietly in the background. Across the ocean, the United States watched Japan with wary eyes. American cryptographers had broken parts of Japan's diplomatic code, known as Purple. They could read many of Tokyo's secret communications, but not all, and not fast enough. Reports flooded Washington: Japanese troop movements in Indochina, strange radio silence among their naval forces, diplomatic delays, yet no one could see the pattern clearly. Intelligence officers suspected that Japan might strike somewhere soon, perhaps in the Philippines, Thailand, or British Malaya. But Hawaii? The idea seemed far-fetched. To most in Washington and Pearl Harbor, the island base was simply too far away, too well defended, too obvious a target. In Tokyo, the government wrestled with 2 futures. On one side, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and the military argued that Japan's honor and survival demanded war. On the other, diplomats pleaded for more time, more negotiation, more compromise. But the oil embargo had left Japan desperate. Its reserves were dwindling, enough for only about 2 years of operations. Without access to foreign oil, Japan's empire would crumble before it could expand. Yamamoto himself had warned the government. Japan could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, before America's vast industry overwhelmed them. But still, the order came. War was inevitable. On December 1, 1941, Emperor Hirohito formally approved Japan's decision to go to war. The fleet already at sea was given its final instructions. If negotiations failed by December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor would proceed as planned. Admiral Nagumo's ships continued eastward, through icy seas and dense fog. They passed north of the Aleutian Islands unseen by any patrol. On board, the men were told only that they were part of a mission vital to Japan's future. As they sailed, the crew cleaned their aircraft, checked their weapons, and wrote letters home. Letters that would be censored until the war's end. For most, it was their last journey in peace. While Japan's fleet crossed the Pacific, life in Hawaii carried on normally. In the warm December sun, families shopped in Honolulu's markets. Sailors played baseball, attended dances, and spent their pay in local cafes. It was the holiday season, and the islands were calm. The American military, though aware of growing tension, remained confident. Hawaii was more than 4,000 miles from Japan, a distance most officers believed made an attack impossible. Radar stations were still new and rarely used at night. Aircraft were parked wingtip to prevent sabotage, not an aerial strike, and despite warnings from Washington, few believed danger was imminent. In the days before December 7th, small but crucial signs emerged, clues that something was coming. In Washington, intercepted Japanese messages hinted that negotiations would soon end. A final long message, known later as the 14-part message, was sent to Japan's embassy in Washington. It instructed the ambassadors to deliver it at 1 p.m. Washington time, early morning in Hawaii. Some analysts grew uneasy. The timing was suspicious, but no one could say for sure what it meant. No one realized that at that exact hour, bombs would already be falling on Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, a small Japanese submarine group crept toward Hawaii. Their mission, infiltrate the harbor before the air attack began. One of these subs would be spotted and attacked just hours before the main assault, but by then it was too late. By December 6, 1941, the Japanese fleet had reached its final position, about 230 miles north of Oahu. The weather was clear, the sea was calm, the target was ready. That evening, Admiral Nagumo gathered his officers aboard the flagship Akagi. Orders were brief, delivered without ceremony. At dawn, the first wave would launch. No one spoke of failure. Pilots went to their bunks, sleeping in full gear, their flight suits zipped, their helmets beside them. Many carried small good luck charms or family photos. In the dark, the low hum of engines echoed across the sea. It was the sound of history approaching. That same night in Washington, President Roosevelt was reviewing a message from Japan, the final note delivered before war. He read it carefully, sensing that peace was slipping away. But no one in the capital, or in Hawaii, could imagine what was about to happen. On the island of Oahu, it was still the weekend. The sky was clear, the air warm. Sailors relaxed in the barracks, reading letters from home. Pilots prepared for routine training flights. And across the harbor, the great battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet rested silently in the morning calm. Shortly after midnight on December 7th, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind. The decks came alive with motion, mechanics checking engines, armorers loading bombs, pilots climbing into cockpits. Each aircraft bore the red circle of the rising sun. Below deck, mechanics whispered quiet prayers. Above, commanders checked their watches. At 6 a.m., Admiral Nagumo gave the order, launch the first wave. Engines roared to life. One by one, the planes accelerated down the carrier decks and lifted into the cold Pacific sky. The mission that would change the world was underway. As the planes flew south toward Oahu, the rising sun glowed behind them, a red light over dark waters. For many of those pilots, the light was symbolic. Japan's empire was rising, bold and unstoppable. They believed their attack would force America to retreat, allowing Asia to belong to Asians once more. But others felt unease. Some wondered if the gamble was too great, if Japan could truly defeat a nation with such vast industry and power. Still, duty came first. They had been trained for this moment. The course was set. Far below, the Hawaiian Islands slept peacefully, unaware of the 183 aircraft descending toward them through the morning sky. The Pacific, silent for centuries, was about to erupt. In minutes, fire would rain from the sky. Battleships would vanish beneath burning oil, and a new era of war would begin, one that would reach every ocean, every continent, and every soul touched by history. December 1941. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, the world moved quietly toward catastrophe. The Japanese strike force, 6 carriers, 2 battleships, and a fleet of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, was already on its way. For nearly 2 weeks they had sailed under a blanket of secrecy, cutting through the icy waters north of Midway Island, unseen and unheard. Their destination was set. Their orders were clear. and the moment that would change history was drawing near. At the center of this operation stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy. A brilliant strategist, Yamamoto had no illusions about what Japan was facing. He once warned his superiors, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." He knew Japan could not win a long war against the United States. Its industrial power, its resources, its population, all dwarfed Japan's capabilities. But if Japan could strike hard enough, if it could deliver a blow so devastating that America would lose the will to fight, then, perhaps, the empire might force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate hope, but it was all Japan had left. The plan to attack Pearl Harbor was known as Operation Z. It was one of the most complex and daring military operations ever conceived. Japan's Navy would launch hundreds of aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers and fighters from carriers more than 230 miles north of Oahu. They would strike fast, before American forces could react, and cripple the Pacific Fleet in a single morning. The goal was simple: sink or disable as many of America's battleships and aircraft as possible. Without its Navy, the U.S. would be unable to stop Japan's expansion into the Pacific. The operation was rehearsed meticulously. Pilots trained in secret to fly low over shallow waters. Torpedoes were modified to run through Pearl Harbor's depths without hitting the seabed. Every detail, from timing to weather, was studied with precision. Yamamoto's orders were absolute. The attack must be a complete surprise. To maintain secrecy, the strike force, known as the Kito Butai, maintained total radio silence. No messages were sent, no transmissions received. Even Japan's own naval bases were left in the dark. Each ship carried its orders sealed in envelopes, to be opened only after leaving home waters. The men on board were told only that they were heading into battle. Their destination remained unspoken, though many guessed the truth. Above deck, the cold winds cut through the crew's faces. Below deck, pilots studied maps of Oahu, memorizing airfields, ship positions, and harbor defenses. They knew this mission was more than an attack. It was a declaration, one that would awaken a sleeping giant. Back in Tokyo, diplomacy continued, at least on the surface. Japanese diplomats in Washington, Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu, were still meeting with American officials. The State Department, led by Secretary of State Cordell Hull, believed that talks might still prevent war, but in truth the diplomats were negotiating blind. The Japanese government had already set the date for war, December 8, 1941, Tokyo time, December 7th in Hawaii. On December 6th, a long message arrived from Tokyo to its embassy in Washington. It was 14 parts long. American cryptographers intercepted and decoded it, but only the first 13 parts were translated before midnight. The final section, the one breaking off negotiations, would arrive too late. By the time the message reached Washington, Japanese planes were already in the air. In the days leading up to the attack, the United States received several warnings, fragments of intelligence that hinted at danger, but never enough to reveal the full picture. On December 3rd, American intelligence learned that Japan had ordered all of its embassies to destroy secret codes and sensitive documents. It was a clear sign that something was coming, but where and when, no one could tell. In Hawaii, Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short, commanders of the Navy and Army forces, were alert but calm. They believed any Japanese attack would strike in the Philippines, Guam, or Thailand, not Hawaii. Even as reports came in of Japanese submarines sighted near the islands, they were dismissed as routine. The Pacific was vast and false alarms were common. The truth was hidden in plain sight. On the night of December 6th, Pearl Harbor lay quiet beneath a starry Hawaiian sky. Sailors returned from shore leave, some carrying souvenirs and postcards home. Band music echoed across the harbor. Couples danced in Honolulu. No one knew they were spending their last night in peace. At that very moment, the Japanese strike force had reached its final position, 230 miles north of Oahu. The order came from Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier task force. The attack will commence tomorrow at dawn. Pilots gathered in briefings aboard the carriers. They studied aerial photographs of Pearl Harbor, its battleships neatly lined up along Battleship Row, its airfields stretching across the island. The targets were marked, the timing exact. At 6 a.m. the first wave would launch. The attacking force consisted of 353 aircraft divided into two waves. The first wave, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, carried 49 high-altitude bombers, 51 dive bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, and 43 fighters, their primary targets the battleships and airfields. The second wave, under Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, would strike later, finishing what the first wave began. Each pilot carried not just weapons, but history itself. Many wrote final letters to their families. Some tied ceremonial scarves to their flight gear, symbols of loyalty and honor. They were told that Japan's diplomats would deliver a message to Washington at the same time. The attack began, a formal end to negotiations. That message would never be delivered in time. Sunday, December 7, 1941. It was just after 6 in the morning. Across Oahu, the island began to stir. The air was warm, the sky clear. On the decks of battleships, sailors prepared for inspection. At nearby airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows, mechanics worked on planes, unaware of the armada approaching from the north. At the same time, a small U.S. Navy radar station at Opana Point detected a large group of aircraft approaching from the north. The operators, Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott, reported the sighting. Their supervisor dismissed it, assuming it was a group of American B-17 bombers expected from California. It was the last warning before disaster. At 6 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared off the carrier decks. Engines thundered through the cold Pacific air as 183 planes took flight. They formed up in tight formation, flying low to avoid radar detection. The rising sun glowed behind them, the same emblem painted on their wings. Below, the ocean shimmered like glass. Ahead lay the green mountains of Oahu and the unsuspecting heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Commander Fuchida looked down at his watch. He raised his hand, signaling to the men behind him. The words he would soon speak would echo through history. As the Japanese planes crossed the northern tip of Oahu, the island below remained peaceful. Church bells rang. Breakfast was served aboard ships. Sailors read letters from home. No alarms, no defenses, no sense of what was about to unfold. At 7:49 a.m., Commander Fuchida looked down through the clouds and saw the harbor below, filled with American battleships gleaming in the sun. He reached for his radio and shouted the code words, "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." The message meant one thing: complete surprise. Sunday morning, December 7, 1941. It was 7:49 a.m. in Hawaii. The Pacific sun had barely climbed over the horizon when the sky above Oahu filled with the sound of engines. A deep, growing roar that broke the morning silence. For the men stationed at Pearl Harbor, it was just another quiet Sunday. But within seconds, paradise would turn into hell. From the northern sky, 183 Japanese aircraft descended through the clouds. At their head flew Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had signaled "Tora, Tora, Tora" moments earlier. The pilots could see it now. Pearl Harbor, calm and glittering below them. 7 U.S. battleships sat moored along Battleship Row, lined up neatly beside Ford Island. The Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, and Maryland. It was everything the Japanese had hoped for. The Pacific Fleet, anchored and vulnerable. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. The attack began at the Naval Air Station on Ford Island, where torpedo bombers streaked low across the water. They released modified torpedoes, each tipped with wooden fins to prevent them from sinking too deep. The first torpedo slammed into the side of the USS Oklahoma. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the battleship began to roll over, trapping hundreds of men below deck. On the USS West Virginia, sailors scrambled for battle stations as torpedoes tore through the hull. Water flooded the lower compartments. Smoke poured from the deck. The Pacific Fleet, America's pride, was being torn apart. As torpedoes hit their marks, dive bombers swooped down from the clouds, targeting the battleships with armor-piercing bombs. The USS Arizona was struck at 8:06 a.m. A single 1,760-pound bomb pierced the deck near the forward magazines, where hundreds of tons of ammunition were stored. For a brief moment there was silence. Then, a blinding flash, a thunderous explosion ripped the ship in half, sending a fireball 600 feet into the air. The blast shattered windows miles away. In an instant, more than 100 men were killed, nearly the entire crew. The Arizona sank within 9 minutes, her hull engulfed in flames. Oil spilled from her tanks, covering the harbor in a thick, burning layer. The water itself seemed to catch fire. Across the harbor, confusion reigned. Some thought it was a drill, others an accident, but the rising columns of smoke told the truth. Sailors sprinted to their stations, some barefoot, others still in pajamas. Machine guns barked at the sky, firing blindly at the attacking planes. But it was too late. The Japanese had achieved total surprise. On Ford Island, mechanics tried desperately to get aircraft airborne. At Wheeler Field, rows of American planes sat parked wing to wing, easy targets for strafing runs. In minutes, dozens of fighters were destroyed on the ground, their fuel tanks erupting into flames. The sky turned black with smoke. Everywhere the sound of screaming engines, explosions, and the cries of the wounded. In the chaos, stories of courage began to unfold. Aboard the USS West Virginia, Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor and his men fought to keep their ship from capsizing. They organized bucket brigades, carried the wounded to safety, and manned anti-aircraft guns even as flames engulfed the deck. On the overturned USS Oklahoma, trapped sailors banged on the hull with wrenches and hammers, signals for help from inside the darkness. Rescue crews rushed in with cutting torches, working for days to reach survivors. At Hickam Field, firefighters braved burning hangars to save trapped airmen. Some soldiers manned machine guns until their last breath. And in the harbor's oily water, hundreds of sailors swam through fire, searching for anything that could float. Many were pulled to safety by small boats. Others disappeared beneath the black smoke forever. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave arrived, 171 more aircraft descending from the north. Their orders: finish the job. They targeted remaining ships, fuel depots, and airfields. Dive bombers screamed toward the USS Nevada, the only battleship able to move. She had managed to raise steam and was making a desperate run toward the open sea. But as the Nevada moved through the harbor, she became a prime target. Hit repeatedly by bombs and torpedoes, her captain made the decision to beach her near Hospital Point, preventing her from blocking the harbor entrance. The Nevada settled in the shallow water, her decks ablaze, her flag still flying. At the Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, the first wounded began to arrive within minutes. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers worked around the clock, treating burns, shrapnel wounds, and broken limbs. Operating tables overflowed. Blood supplies ran low. Outside, the harbor burned. Thick black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, visible across the entire island. The water boiled with oil and fire. By 10 a.m., the last Japanese planes were gone. In less than 2 hours, they had crippled one of the most powerful naval forces in the world. When the smoke began to clear, the scale of destruction became horrifyingly clear. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and nearly 200 aircraft were lost. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. Over 100 were wounded. The harbor was a graveyard of twisted metal and fire. The USS Arizona still burned. The USS Oklahoma lay upside down, her crew trapped inside. The once proud Pacific Fleet was crippled, but not broken. As the last planes returned to their carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced a crucial decision. Some of his officers urged a third wave to strike the shipyards, oil depots, and repair facilities. But Nagumo, fearing American counterattacks and low fuel, decided to withdraw. It was a tactical victory, but a strategic mistake. The untouched shipyards and fuel reserves would later help rebuild the Pacific Fleet faster than Japan ever expected. On board his flagship, Commander Fuchida sent his report back to Tokyo. Enemy fleet anchored in Pearl Harbor. Successful surprise attack. In Japan, the news was met with celebration. The empire had struck a blow no one thought possible. But Yamamoto, the mastermind of the plan, remained silent. He is said to have whispered words that would haunt history. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Across the Pacific, the world watched in shock. In Washington, D.C., word of the attack reached President Franklin D. Roosevelt just before 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. He sat silently for a moment, then turned to his secretary and said, "This means war." The following day, December 8, 1941, Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. Archival voice overlay. Roosevelt's speech faintly heard. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. His words echoed across the nation. Within hours, Congress voted to declare war on Japan. The United States, once hesitant and divided, was now united with a single purpose. And so, the Pacific War began. In the days that followed, survivors searched through wreckage and ash. Divers worked tirelessly to recover bodies trapped within the sunken ships. The smell of oil and death lingered for weeks. Yet amid the loss, there was resilience. Sailors who survived returned to duty. Mechanics salvaged what they could. The same shipyards Japan had spared began repairing damaged vessels, some of which would return to fight again at battles like Midway and Leyte Gulf. The harbor that had burned became the symbol of a nation reborn. Pearl Harbor was not just a military disaster, it was a turning point in history. It ended America's isolation. It united a divided people, and it propelled the world into a new, devastating phase of global war. The Japanese had hoped to buy 6 months of advantage. They gained exactly that, and nothing more. Within a year, the tide would begin to turn, and the Pacific, once Japan's empire of dreams, would become the arena of its defeat. Today, the waters of Pearl Harbor are quiet again. Beneath the surface, the remains of the USS Arizona still rest, her crew entombed within. Oil still seeps from the hull, rising to the surface like black tears, a reminder of the morning when peace died, and history changed forever. From the calm Pacific to the fires of war, the attack on Pearl Harbor was not the end of an era. It was the beginning of a new world. When the sun rose again over Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, the island lay in ruins. The smoke still hung thick over the harbor. Ships that once represented the pride of a nation now rested broken and burning. Bodies floated among the debris. The air reeked of oil, metal, and death. For the survivors, the nightmare had not ended. It had only just begun. All through the night, rescue crews worked tirelessly. Divers entered flooded compartments, searching for survivors trapped inside the ships. The sound of hammering echoed across the harbor. Men still alive inside the USS Oklahoma tapping for help. Teams with torches cut through the steel, working in shifts to avoid exhaustion. Over the next 2 days, they rescued 32 men from inside the overturned ship. For many others, help came too late. On the USS Arizona, there was nothing to be done. Her hull had been torn open, her crew sealed within. More than 1,000 men lay entombed below the water, where they remain to this day. Amid the devastation, stories of survival and heroism emerged, acts of courage that defined the American spirit. Chief Petty Officer John Finn, stationed at Kaneohe Bay, grabbed a machine gun and fought back against Japanese planes for more than 2 hours. even after being wounded 21 times. His bravery earned him the Medal of Honor. Doris "Dory" Miller, a mess attendant on the USS West Virginia, carried wounded men to safety before manning an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to use. He shot down multiple enemy planes before the ship sank beneath him. His actions made him one of the first American heroes of the war. Across the harbor, countless others, sailors, nurses, civilians, fought to save lives, risking their own amid fire and chaos. In tragedy, their courage became a beacon of hope. By the end of that dark day, the numbers told a grim story. 2,403 Americans dead, 78 wounded, 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, 188 aircraft lost. The Japanese, by contrast, had lost only 29 planes and 5 submarines. It was a devastating blow, the worst naval defeat in American history. Yet even as the nation mourned, something deeper began to rise, a fierce, unbreakable resolve. When news of the attack reached the mainland, disbelief swept across the country. Newspapers rushed to print the headlines, "War. Japs bomb Pearl Harbor. U.S. base in flames." Americans crowded around radios listening to emergency broadcasts. Parents wept. Soldiers volunteered. Factories prepared for war. In Washington, D.C., President Franklin D. Roosevelt gathered his advisors in the Oval Office. He spoke few words, but his mind was already set. There would be no hesitation, no retreat. The United States would strike back. On December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, a speech that would echo through history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. As he spoke, the entire nation listened in silence. He described the treachery, the deception, and the loss. Then, with unshakable calm, he declared, "No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory." The chamber erupted in applause. Within hours, Congress voted 308 to 1 to declare war on Japan. The lone vote against came from Representative Jeannette Rankin, a lifelong pacifist, the same woman who had opposed entry into World War I. But the rest of the nation was united. America had been attacked, and America would fight. 3 days later, on December 11th, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy declared war on the United States, honoring their alliance with Japan. In response, the U.S. declared war on them as well. In less than a week, America found itself fully engaged in a global conflict, fighting across both the Atlantic and the Pacific. The sleeping giant had awakened. Factories began converting overnight. Car plants became tank factories. Aircraft production soared. Men and women enlisted by the millions. The attack meant to break America had, instead, forged it into something unstoppable. In Tokyo, news of the victory at Pearl Harbor spread like wildfire. Crowds cheered in the streets. Emperor Hirohito gave his blessing. Japanese newspapers declared the empire's triumph over Western arrogance. But within the Imperial Navy, not everyone celebrated. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, remained troubled. He knew the Americans, their industry, their spirit, their unity. He had lived among them, studied them, and understood their resolve. His private words would later become legendary. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yamamoto knew that Japan's victory would be brief. The United States would rebuild, and when it did, it would come with vengeance. In Hawaii, recovery continued for weeks. Divers entered the sunken ships, pulling bodies from twisted corridors. The harbor became a graveyard, but also a memorial. On the USS Arizona, flames burned for 2 days straight. Oil continued to leak from her tanks, a phenomenon that still continues today, known as the Black Tears of the Arizona. Families waited for letters that would never arrive. Across America, telegrams began to appear on doorsteps, each beginning with the same words: "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you." Yet even through grief, the nation rallied, enlistment offices overflowed, civilians donated metal, rubber, and supplies. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" spread like wildfire, painted on walls, printed on posters, shouted in parades. It became not just a slogan, but a promise. Within months, the United States had begun one of the greatest industrial mobilizations in history. New ships rolled out of shipyards every week. Fighter planes filled the skies. Aircraft carriers, once few in number, became the backbone of the new Navy. Women entered factories by the millions, taking on jobs once held by men. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of strength and patriotism. From coast to coast, America transformed itself from a peacetime nation into the arsenal of democracy. And it all began with the burning harbor of Hawaii. By April 1942, the United States was ready to strike back. In a daring mission led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, 16 B-25 bombers took off from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, something that had never been done before. Their target, Tokyo itself. Though the Doolittle raid caused minimal physical damage, its psychological impact was immense. For the first time, Japanese civilians heard American bombs fall on their capital. It proved that Japan was not untouchable. The raid lifted American morale and set the stage for the next great confrontation, one that would determine the fate of the Pacific: the Battle of Midway. The attack on Pearl Harbor had begun as a moment of tragedy, but it became the spark that united a nation. America, once divided and hesitant, was now driven by a single purpose: victory. The factories roared, the soldiers trained, every family had someone in uniform. Every heart carried the same words: "Remember Pearl Harbor." The Pacific would soon witness fierce and bloody battles. Coral Sea, Guadalcanal, and Midway, each one bringing Japan closer to defeat, but those would come later. For now, in the early days of 1942, America was still standing in the shadow of its wounds, gathering strength, preparing for payback. In the end, Pearl Harbor was more than a place. It was a moment that reshaped the world. It marked the end of innocence, the end of distance, the end of isolation. It taught that oceans could no longer protect nations. It showed that even in the darkest moment, courage could rise from the ashes, from the blackened decks of the Arizona to the steel foundries of Detroit, to the battlefields yet to come. The spirit born that day would carry the world toward victory. Pearl Harbor was not just the day America entered the war. It was the day America became a leader of the free world. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, the United States of America transformed. The chaos of December 7th had hardened into focus. The shock had turned into strategy. And the nation that had once watched from afar was now ready to lead the fight. The Pacific, vast, unforgiving, endless, became the stage where America would rise again. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, it believed the blow would cripple American naval power for years. But they had miscalculated. The battleships had been destroyed, but the aircraft carriers, the true lifeblood of modern warfare, were at sea during the attack. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga survived untouched. Within weeks, the shipyards of America roared back to life. Welders worked day and night. Sunken vessels were raised, repaired, and refitted. By mid-1942, ships that once lay at the bottom of the harbor were sailing again. Pearl Harbor itself, once a graveyard, became the center of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's resurgence. Meanwhile, Japan's victories spread across the Pacific. Within months, they had captured the Philippines, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore, the greatest British fortress in the East. Their empire stretched across thousands of miles. From Burma to the Solomon Islands, their flag flew over lands once thought unreachable, but success bred overconfidence. And hidden beneath Japan's triumphs was a growing arrogance, the belief that America lacked the will to fight back. They were wrong. The Doolittle raid, launched in April 1942, had been a daring gesture, symbolic, but deeply unsettling for Japan. It showed that the U.S. could strike the Japanese homeland. In response, Japan sought to eliminate the American carrier threat once and for all. Their plan: lure the U.S. fleet into a trap and destroy it completely. The target they chose was a small, remote atoll halfway between Asia and America, Midway Island. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, still haunted by his earlier warning, devised the operation. 4 of Japan's best carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would attack Midway. They expected the Americans to respond. When they did, Japan's superior numbers would crush them. It was a flawless plan, on paper. But Yamamoto didn't know that his enemy was already listening. In a hidden intelligence center in Hawaii, a group of American cryptanalysts had been tirelessly working to crack Japanese communication codes. By May 1942, they succeeded. The Americans learned that AF, the coded location of Japan's next target, referred to Midway. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, prepared an ambush of his own. He positioned his remaining carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting for Japan's fleet to appear. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America was ready not just to defend, but to strike. On June 4, 1942, the skies above Midway erupted in battle. At dawn, Japanese aircraft bombed the island, softening defenses for an invasion. But as they prepared for a second wave, American scout planes spotted their carriers. What followed would become one of the most decisive battles in naval history. At 10:20 a.m., U.S. dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown descended from the clouds. In 5 breathtaking minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. The 4th, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that damaged the Yorktown, but was soon found and destroyed as well. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers lay sinking beneath the waves, the same 4 that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The victory was complete. Japan's naval power had been broken. The Battle of Midway changed everything. For Japan, it marked the beginning of the end. For the United States, it marked the beginning of victory. The Pacific, once an empire's playground, had become a battlefield where America now held the advantage. In a single day, the tide of war had turned. Victory at Midway gave America hope, but the war was far from over. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. For 6 months, the island became a place of endless struggle, jungle warfare, disease, and exhaustion. But the Marines held their ground. When the battle finally ended, Japan had lost its ability to fight offensively. From that point on, they would only retreat. Many of the men who fought in these battles were survivors of Pearl Harbor. They carried with them not just memories, but purpose. On the decks of new carriers, in the cockpits of new planes, they avenged their fallen comrades. The names Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia were remembered, whispered before takeoff, etched on the sides of bombs. For them, the war was personal. Every mission, every strike, every victory. A silent promise kept. As 1943 turned into 1944, Japan's once mighty empire began to crumble. The U.S. Navy's industrial power overwhelmed the Pacific. Dozens of new carriers filled the seas. American submarines cut off Japanese supply lines. Island by island, the U.S. advanced: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each victory brought the Allies closer to Japan's doorstep. By mid-1945, Japan's navy was gone. Its cities were burning, and the weapon that would end the war was being prepared in secret. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped the world's first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The destruction was unimaginable. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, under the gaze of an American flag that had once flown over Pearl Harbor. The war that had begun with fire in Hawaii ended with fire in Japan. Pearl Harbor changed more than just the course of a war. It reshaped how nations viewed peace, power, and vigilance. It taught that freedom was fragile, that distance offered no safety, and that unity could rise from devastation. Every December 7th, the waters of Pearl Harbor remain calm, but beneath them lies a silent reminder. The wreck of the USS Arizona still leaks its black tears, a constant reminder of those lost. Visitors stand above her, reading the names carved in marble. Oil still bubbles to the surface, as if the ship still breathes, still remembers. More than 80 years later, the echoes of that morning still reach across generations. The thunder of bombs has faded, but the lessons remain. Pearl Harbor was not just a tragedy of the past. It was a beginning. The moment when the world changed, when courage rose, and when freedom found its defenders. They awoke a sleeping giant, and the giant never slept again.